Normally, I wouldn't have given it a second thought. Melanie and I had been married for 12 years, and if there was one thing I trusted, it was her. My wife, Melanie, was upstairs in the shower, and her cell phone, resting on the counter, wouldn't stop buzzing. But something was gnawing at me this morning. Maybe it was the sheer number of notifications per minute, or maybe it was the name on the screen. Ethan. My brother. I picked up my phone, intending to just turn it off. But as soon as I saw the preview of the first message, my gut clenched. Last night was amazing. I can't wait to see you again. For a second, I froze. My mind tried to connect all the dots. Ethan was my little brother. He was the one I shared bunk beds with, the one I fought over video games with, and the one I celebrated milestones with. He wasn't just a family member. He was my best friend. Why was he texting my wife like that? What could he possibly mean? I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe a joke. Ethan had always been a joker, pushing boundaries, saying inappropriate things to get a laugh. That's what it's all about, isn't it? But then my thumb betrayed me, opening the subject line of the post before my brain could realize what I was doing. And that's when I saw it. An avalanche of messages. Flirtatious, intimate, explicit messages. They weren't humorous. They weren't ambiguous. They were unmistakable. I wish I could have stayed longer. You looked incredible last night. Do you think he suspects something? My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might explode. The words on the screen blurred and tears flooded my eyes. My knees buckled, and I sank heavily into one of the kitchen chairs without letting go of my phone. I scrolled up the page, desperately trying to find a starting point, something that would explain how this nightmare had started. It didn't take me long to piece it all together. The affair began months ago. Quiet moments stolen during family gatherings, errands that took up too much time, trips that my wife claimed involved visiting friends. Ethan, always hanging around, always charming and charismatic, slipped into her life like a snake into the grass. I remembered Thanksgiving, just a few months earlier. Ethan was helping Melanie carve the turkey, his hands touching her arms as they worked in sync. I wasn't thinking about anything. Why would I? He was my brother. She was my wife. They were the two people I loved and trusted more than anyone else in the world. Now every memory was tainted. Every smile, every laugh, every moment together. It all felt like a lie. Dad, are you okay? I looked up and saw my oldest son, Jackson, looking at me wide-eyed. I realized I was shaking. I was clutching the phone so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I forced myself to smile, even though I felt like my face might crack. I'm fine, buddy, I lied. Why don't you go back to the table and finish your breakfast? He hesitated, his gaze darting to the phone in my hand. I quickly placed it on the table face down. Jackson nodded and turned back to his siblings, but I could feel his curious gaze on me. My thoughts raced. What was I supposed to do? Confront her now? Wait until the kids were gone? And Ethan, what about him? He lived less than 10 minutes away. I felt an overwhelming urge to drive to his house, kick in the door, and demand answers. But before I could do anything, Melanie's footsteps sounded on the stairs. "Good morning," she said, her voice light and cheerful as she entered the kitchen. Her wet hair was tucked into a bun, and she was wearing one of my old college sweatshirts. The sight of her, so familiar, so ordinary, made my stomach rumble. How could she act like nothing was wrong? Like she wasn't sleeping with my brother behind my back? I couldn't help myself. "Your phone is ringing," I said, my voice strained. She looked at the counter, her expression unreadable. "Oh, it's probably just work stuff." "Really?" I said, standing up. "Because I don't think your boss would be texting you about how awesome last night was." Her face went pale. For a moment we just stared at each other, and my words hung in the air. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. I reached for her phone, which was still on the table, and picked it up. "Why don't you explain?" My voice shook, anger and heartache mixed in it. Melanie's eyes filled with tears. "I can explain," she whispered. "Explain what?" snapped I. "How long has this been going on? How could you do this to me? To us? To our family?" The kids looked at me, oblivious to their cereal. I realized I was yelling and forced myself to lower my voice. "Go upstairs," I said, gesturing toward the stairs. All of you. They hesitated, their little faces full of confusion and fear, but finally they obeyed. As soon as they were out of sight, Melanie collapsed into the chair I had just vacated. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "It was a mistake." "A mistake?" I interrupted her. "The mistake was forgetting to take out the trash. Sleeping with my brother is not a mistake." She didn't answer anything, just hid her face in her palms. I wanted to scream at her, to shake her, to make her feel even a fraction of the pain I was feeling. But all I could do was stand still, stunned and broken. I thought I knew what betrayal was. I thought I understood what heartbreak was. But nothing could have prepared me for this. The few hours after discovering the texts passed like a blur. I couldn't focus. I couldn't think straight. Every time I tried to distract myself, watching TV, leafing through my phone, even walking around the kitchen, I heard his words again. "Last night was amazing. I can't wait to see you again." I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The kids had already gone upstairs, their innocence hiding them from the storm raging in our house. Melanie hadn't uttered a word since I'd confronted her the day before. She had cried in the bathroom for hours, but not once had she come to me. Not once did she try to fix the situation, or even lie to get out of it. She just left me alone with my thoughts, and those thoughts were a tidal wave of pain, anger, and confusion. When the house became quiet, I realized I had to face her. The shock passed and I was left with one burning question. Why? Around midnight, I stood at the foot of the stairs and called out to her in a voice I barely recognized as my own. "Melanie, come down here. We need to talk." A long pause followed before I heard her shuffling down the stairs. She looked exhausted, her face blotchy and tear-stained. For a split second, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered who she was and what she had done, and my resolve grew firmer. "Sit down," I said, pointing to the couch. She obeyed and sat down like a delinquent teenager caught walking after curfew. I remained standing, needing distance so I didn't explode immediately. The room was dimly lit, and shadows seemed to envelope it, making it seem smaller than I'd ever seen it before. "I want to know everything," I said, my voice low but firm. "No lies. No excuses. Just tell me the truth." She opened her mouth, then closed it again, clenching her hands into fists. After what seemed like an eternity, she finally whispered, "This shouldn't have happened." "It wasn't supposed to happen?" I repeated, raising my voice. "You mean you weren't planning on sleeping with my brother? That's supposed to make me feel better?" "No," she said quickly, her voice trailing off. "No, I know it wouldn't. I'm not trying to make excuses, I swear. It's just, it happened, and I can't take it all back." "How long?" I demanded. "How long has it been going on?" She hesitated, making my blood boil even harder. "For months," she finally admitted, her voice so soft I almost didn't catch it. "For months. For months of lies, of sneaking around while they laughed behind my back and I, oblivious to my life, trusted them both. For months of letting my kids play with my uncle, completely unaware of what kind of man he really was." "And when did it start?" I asked. "Was it a one-off that just spiraled, or was it a slow, deliberate betrayal?" She flinched at the word betrayal, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of defiance in her tear-filled eyes. "It wasn't premeditated," she said. It just happened. After your father's birthday party." I remembered that night. It had been a rare family party that everyone had come to. Ethan was charming as always, cracking jokes and helping in the kitchen. Melanie was quieter than usual, but I chalked it up to fatigue. I never imagined this night would be the starting point for my world to fall apart. "Does he love you?" I asked bitterly, and the words sounded like poison. Her eyes widened, and she shook her head violently. "No. God, no. It's not like that." "Then what the hell is it?" I exclaimed, finally losing control of my emotions. "What could make you think it's okay? That risking everything we've built together, our kids, our family, our lives, was worth it?" She broke down again, burying her face in her hands. But I wasn't going to let her tears stop me this time. "Answer me, Melanie. I deserve it, don't I?" "I don't know." She sobbed. I don't know why I did it. I was stupid and selfish, and I hate myself for it. Her words seemed hollow, like they were rehearsed for a bad soap opera. But I didn't have the energy to press her further. I was too tired, too raw. Go to bed, I said finally, my voice cold. We'll decide what to do tomorrow. She looked up at me, her face full of despair. Please, just let me. Go to bed, Melanie. She staggered and went upstairs, leaving me alone in the dimly lit living room. I sank down on the couch, staring at the spot where she had just sat, my mind a chaotic mess of thoughts and emotions. I woke up the next morning feeling even worse than the night before. There was a suffocating air between Melanie and me as we moved around the house getting the kids ready for the day. I couldn't even look at her without wanting to scream. By the time she left to take the kids to her mom, I had already made my decision. This wasn't the end. It certainly wasn't the end. I wasn't just mad at her. I'd be furious at Ethan. And I needed to confront him. I drove to his house, clutching the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The rage inside me was like a volcano ready to erupt. I didn't care what he said. I didn't care if he apologized. I just needed to look him in the eye and make him feel at least some of the pain he'd caused. When I pulled up to his house, he came to the door almost immediately, smiling like he didn't care. But as soon as he saw my face, his smile disappeared. Hey man, he started, but I interrupted him. Don't give me a hey dude, I snapped back, my voice shaking. You know why I'm here. He turned away, running a hand through his hair. Look, No, I stepped closer, clenching my fists at my sides. You can't talk. You can't explain. You slept with my wife. My wife, Ethan. How could you do that? How could you look me in the eye and call me your brother while you were fucking her behind my back? It just happened, okay? He said, his tone defensive. I didn't mean to. Bullshit. I shouted. Don't you dare act like it was some kind of accident. You made a choice. Both of you did. He was silent for a while. Then he looked up at me, a look of regret on his face. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I know I messed up. I never meant to hurt you. His words were like acid eating away what little I had left. I'm sorry, I said, lowering my voice dangerously. Do you think apologizing will make things better? I don't know, he admitted, but that's all I can say. I stared at him, at the brother I'd once idolized, the man I thought I could trust more than anyone else. And in that moment, I realized I would never look at him the same way again. Stay away from me. Stay away from my family, I said, and my voice shook. You're dead to me. And with those words, I turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the doorway. In the weeks that followed, betrayal consumed me. I wasn't just angry. I was gutted, devastated. My thoughts became a continuous montage of memories, each now tainted, each painted with the ugly truth of what had gone on behind my back. Every quiet moment became a new opportunity for my brain to torture me. I couldn't escape it. The first memory that haunted me came out of nowhere one evening as I sat alone in the living room. It was one of those lazy summer evenings from our childhood. Ethan and I were in the backyard, taking turns pitching our voices to each other. I was probably about 12 years old and Ethan was 9. He was skinny then, all elbows and knees, but he had a great fastball for his age. He pitched the ball right down the middle that day, and I hit it exactly on target. The ball flew over the fence into the neighbor's yard and disappeared into a thicket of bushes. Ethan squealed and screamed like I had just made a big slam in the World Series. He'd always been like that, my biggest fan. I was the big brother he looked up to. Or so I thought. Now those memories seemed like a cruel joke to me. The same kid who admired me, who once said he wanted to grow up to be just like me, had grown up to stab me in the back. I wondered if he ever remembered those days, if he ever felt the same guilt that seemed to pulse through me whenever I replayed our childhood in my head. Then there was my wedding day. It was very painful. I kept a framed photo on the mantle, Melanie and I standing under an arch of flowers and glowing with happiness. She was radiant in her dress, her smile so wide it made my eyes ripple. And me? I looked like the happiest man in the world. But now, when I looked at that picture, all I saw was Ethan standing there as best man with a smile on his face. I remembered the toast he gave at the reception, how he called me the best brother anyone could wish for, and said Melanie was the perfect match. The entire room laughed and clinked glasses. He even winked at me, as if we had some secret brotherly bond. That moment played over and over in my head, teasing me. Had he already had his eye on her then? Was he already thinking about how to get into her life? I wanted to break the frame, throw it into the fireplace, and watch the glass shatter and the picture curl up in the flames. But I didn't. It was too easy. Instead, I placed it face down on the mantel, as if that could somehow contain the memories. As the days stretched on, I began to revisit every interaction, every moment, wondering how I had been so blind. Were there signs? I couldn't stop obsessing over the details, trying to piece together the puzzle of how it all started. That time at Jackson's soccer game, Ethan showed up unexpectedly. Melanie looked genuinely surprised, her face lighting up with the kind of warmth that I now realized was all too warm. "What are you doing here?" she asked, laughing as if it was some grand coincidence. He shrugged and said he just wanted to come support my nephew. I didn't think anything of it at the time. After all, he was Uncle Ethan, fun, loving, always there when he was needed. Then there was the time we had a family barbecue in the backyard. Ethan offered to help Melanie in the kitchen, and the two of them spent almost an hour cooking hamburgers and chopping vegetables. At one point I looked in there for a drink and saw them laughing about something. I don't remember what it was about now, but I do remember feeling kind of left out. Melanie brushed it off by saying, "Oh, you know your brother. He's always joking." But it wasn't just about the important moments. It was also about the little things. The way Ethan's hand lingered on her shoulder when he said hello to her, the way she laughed at his jokes that were a little too funny, the way their eyes met across the room at family gatherings. At the time, I wrote it off as them getting along well. I even rejoiced in it, thinking it meant our family was cohesive. Little did I realize that it was all part of their charade. Every memory, however innocent it may have seemed before, was now seen as evidence. And the weight of it all was crushing. On my lunch break, I sat in my car and stared at the steering wheel while the same moments replayed in my head. Ethan teaching Jackson how to throw a spiral in the backyard. Melanie laughing when Ethan teases her about cooking. Me telling Ethan how much I appreciate him being such a great uncle to my kids. It was unbearable. I started avoiding my house when I wasn't with my kids. The walls felt like they were closing in, every corner a reminder of what I had lost. The kitchen table where we used to have family dinners, where Melanie laughed at Ethan's jokes and I sat there, not paying attention. The couch where we watched movies as a family, that's where I'd invited Ethan over, thinking I was keeping the family bond strong. I couldn't stop asking myself, what if? What if I had been more attentive? What if I'd noticed how Melanie's tone softened when she spoke to Ethan? Or how Ethan's smile lingered a little longer when he looked at her? What if I had confronted them earlier, before things had gone too far? Would I have been able to stop it? But the worst part was something I couldn't get rid of. What if it was my fault? I started blaming myself for everything. Maybe I was too focused on work, too busy providing for my family. Maybe I hadn't been as attentive to Melanie as I should have been. Maybe Ethan saw the cracks in our marriage before I did and slipped through them. The thought made me uncomfortable, but I couldn't ignore it. Every day I felt like I had a weight on me that I couldn't shed. Even when I was with the kids, I felt like I was only half there. Jackson would ask me to help him with his homework, and I would catch myself staring dumbly at the page. Emily would run up to me with one of her crayon drawings, and I would force myself to smile, but the smile wouldn't leave my eyes. They deserved better than this, better than a father drowning in his own misery. But how could I be the father they needed if I myself no longer knew who I was? The life I thought I had built, the people I thought I could trust, it was all a lie, and I was a fool not to notice it. One night, as I lay sleepless, staring at the ceiling, I realized something. I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't let these memories consume me, couldn't let Ethan and Melanie's betrayal define me. But the question was how? How do you move on when the people you trusted the most cut you to the core? When the truth came out, it was like dropping a nuclear bomb on my family. I always thought of us as a close-knit family. My parents had raised Ethan and I to value loyalty, family, and trust above all else. But now those values were shattered. lying in shards that no one seemed to know how to put back together. The first person I told about this was my mom. I hadn't planned on it. It all came spilling out during a late-night phone call when she asked why I was feeling so bad. At first there was silence on the other end of the line, as if she couldn't understand what I just said. Melanie and Ethan? She finally whispered, her voice shaking. Are you sure? Yes, Mom, I said, trying to keep my composure. I'm sure. She didn't cry right away, but I could hear the tension in her voice as she tried to reassure me. We'll fix it, she said, as if this was a problem she could smooth over with one of her signature family conversations. I'll talk to him. He'll realize how wrong this is. He'll apologize. Apologizing won't fix it, I said bitterly. It's not like he dented my car, Mom. He betrayed me. He betrayed all of us. I could see that my words had hurt her deeply because her voice trailed off when she replied. Oh, honey, she said, and her sobs finally broke through. How did this happen? What did I do wrong? I must have let you both down somehow. I should have. Her words turned to more crying, and I felt an awkward mixture of anger and guilt. I wanted to tell her that it wasn't her fault in any way, but I was too immersed in my own pain to comfort her. I just let her cry until she said she needed to call her dad and hung up. The next morning, my dad called me. He wasn't an emotional man. He had always been the pillar of the family, calm and poised even in the most difficult situations. But that morning, his voice was cold, curt, and as angry as I'd ever heard him. Is it true? He demanded. What your mother told me last night? Yes. Irritation spread quickly. Mom, trying to keep the family together, insisted on holding a dinner party to talk things over. I didn't want to go, but she pleaded with me, saying it was important for everyone to hear my side of the story. Against my better judgment, I agreed. From the moment I walked through the door, everything went downhill. Ethan was already there, sitting at the dining room table, his jaw clenched and his eyes avoiding everyone else. Mom looked worried and flitted between the kitchen and dining room like a nervous hummingbird, while Dad sat in his chair and looked at Ethan with a look that could burn through steel. When I walked in, there was silence in the room. All eyes turned to me, and the tension was so intense it felt like I was wading through molasses. Ethan looked up briefly, a look of guilt on his face, but I refused to meet his gaze. Instead, I focused on Dad, who stood up and patted me on the shoulder. I'm glad you're here, he said gruffly. This needs to be dealt with. Mom tried to play peacemaker by inviting us to the table and insisting we start with prayer. But as soon as we sat down, the floodgates opened. I just don't understand, Mom said, her voice cracking as she looked at Ethan. Why, Ethan? Why did you do this to your brother? He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze fixed on the tablecloth. I have no excuse, he said quietly. I messed up. I know I screwed up. That's not good enough, his father roared, slamming his fist on the table. You didn't just screw up, Ethan. You ruined your brother's marriage. You betrayed this family. Ethan flinched, but didn't say anything back. I felt my own anger rise to the surface, and before I could stop myself, I joined him. Why don't you tell them the truth, Ethan? I said, sarcasm in my voice. Tell them how long it's been going on. Tell them how you sat and smiled at family gatherings while you slept with my wife. I said I was sorry, he muttered, finally looking up at me. His eyes were red, but I couldn't tell if it was from guilt or self-pity. What else do you want from me? I want you to admit that you're a selfish, spineless bastard, I snarled. I want you to stop acting like this is some random thing you tripped over. You made a choice, Ethan, and now we're all paying the price for it. By the end of the evening, it was clear that there would be no decision. My father was firmly on my side, calling Ethan a disgrace and vowing to never forgive him. My mom, torn between her sons, spent most of the evening crying and begging us to make amends. The extended family only made matters worse. Word spread quickly, thanks in part to my cousins, who loved nothing more than a good drama. Within days, aunts, uncles, and relatives I hadn't spoken to in years began calling and texting me. Some expressed sympathy, others gave unsolicited advice. You need to cut Ethan out of your life, one cousin said bluntly. There's no getting that back. Family is family, An aunt objected. He made a mistake, but you're going to regret it if you don't find a way to forgive him. Forgiveness. It was a word I'd heard so often that it was beginning to feel like a cruel joke. How could I forgive a man who took everything I cared about and threw it in my face? How could I forget the betrayal when every time I saw him, the wound was fresh? Family gatherings became unbearable. Every event turned into a battlefield, with people taking sides and throwing thinly veiled jabs at each other. Thanksgiving had been the worst. Ethan didn't show up, but his absence was like a black hole sucking all the joy out of the room. Dad spent most of dinner glaring at Mom for suggesting that Ethan be invited, and I could feel the tension rolling over my younger cousins who didn't know what to say or do. After dinner, my uncle took me aside and said, "You know, this kind of thing can tear a family apart if you let it. Don't let him win by giving him that kind of power." I nodded, but his words only made me feel worse. The truth was that the family was already torn apart. And no matter what I did, there was no going back to the way things were. In the weeks that followed, I realized that the betrayal wasn't just about me and Melanie or me and Ethan. It was a bomb that exploded in the very center of my family, causing everyone to scramble to pick up the pieces. And no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't put them back together. When the dust first started to settle, or at least when it stopped choking me, I realized how much my kids were in the line of fire. It wasn't their fault that their mother had betrayed me, and it wasn't their fault that their uncle had been complicit in the destruction of the family. But the consequences didn't care which of them was innocent. As much as I wanted to keep the ugliness between Melanie, Ethan, and me, the tension was seeping into everything, and the kids were starting to notice it. In his 10th year, Jackson, my oldest, was old enough to realize something was wrong. Emily, my 7-year-old daughter, was curious rather than concerned, always asking questions with the earnest innocence that I couldn't tarnish. And little Ben, only 4 years old, seemed to suspect nothing, until now. But how long would it last? It had started small. Jackson cornered me one night after Melanie, and I had another heated argument behind closed doors. I thought we'd been quiet enough not to attract attention, but when I turned from the kitchen sink, he was standing in the doorway, arms crossed. "Why are you and Mom fighting?" he asked, his face expressing concern and defiance. My heart dropped. How was I supposed to explain this to a 10-year-old? How could I tell him the truth without destroying his idea of his mother? About his uncle? About me? "We're just having an adult disagreement," I said carefully, dropping to my knees. "That happens sometimes, but it doesn't mean we don't love you or your brother and sister." He narrowed his eyes, clearly not satisfied with my answer. "Is it because Uncle Ethan didn't show up? Did he do something wrong?" I froze, the air leaving my lungs. The kids adored Ethan. He was the fun uncle who played video games with Jackson, gave Emily piggyback rides, and always brought a new toy for Ben. I avoided the subject completely, hoping they wouldn't notice his absence. "Yeah. No, buddy, it's not that simple," I stammered. "Sometimes adults just need a little space." He looked at me for a long moment, then reluctantly nodded, even though I could tell he didn't believe me. "Okay," he said, his voice low. But as he turned to leave, I caught the way his shoulders slumped, the way he lowered his head lower than usual. It was harder with Emily. She'd always been a curious child, asking a million questions about everything from how clouds form to why giraffes have long necks. Now, however, her questions were about the cracks forming in her little world. "Daddy, why are you sleeping on the couch now?" she asked one morning as I was packing her lunch for school. I hesitated, searching for an answer that wouldn't hurt her. "Sometimes it's more convenient," I lied. "But Mommy said you like the bed," she objected, tilting her head like a little detective. "Did you two have a fight? Like Jackson fighting with me over the TV?" I forced myself to smile, even though it was more of a grimace. "Something like that. But we're working on it, honey. Don't worry." Her eyebrows furrowed, and she reached out to take my hand. "I hope you stop fighting soon. I don't like it when people get angry." "Me neither," I said softly, squeezing her hand. It was the truth, but wishing things were better didn't make it so. At night, after I'd put them to bed, the weight of it all seemed unbearable. I sat in the dark living room, staring up at the ceiling, thinking about how I should have shielded them from the reality of what was happening. They deserved a happy home, not one filled with tension and unanswered questions. I thought about telling them the truth. Well, some version of it. Maybe something simplistic like, "Mom and I are having a lot of trouble right now, but it's not your fault and we both love you." But even that felt like a betrayal. How could I tell them that their mom wasn't the person they thought she was? How could I rob them of their innocence? Melanie, despite all her mistakes, was still their mother. She still read them bedtime stories and kissed them on the forehead. She still baked cookies with Emily and cheered for Jackson at his soccer games. I hated her for what she did to me, but I couldn't bring myself to destroy their view of her. I couldn't yet. One night as I was putting Ben to bed, he surprised me with a question I wasn't prepared for. "Daddy, why are you sad?" I froze, my hand halfway to pull the blanket over him. "What do you mean, buddy?" I asked, forcing myself to smile. "You're not happy anymore," he replied simply, looking at me with his big brown eyes. "I can see that. Children are sharper than we give them credit for." I was so focused on acting normal, on hiding my pain, that I didn't realize I was failing. I sat down on the edge of his bed and brushed his hair back. "Sometimes adults get sad too," I said carefully. "But it's not your job to worry about that, you know? Your job is to be a kid and have fun." "But I want you to be happy," he said, his thin voice breaking my heart. "I will be," I promised, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. "As long as I have you and your brother and sister, I'll be fine." He smiled, and for a moment the heaviness on my chest eased a little. In the weeks that followed, I made an effort to be there for the kids. When Jackson wanted to practice soccer, I kicked the ball with him, even if my thoughts were occupied with something else. When Emily asked me to help her with a school project, I spent hours cutting and gluing construction paper to make the perfect solar system. And when Ben wanted to build blanket forts in the living room, I let him, even if it meant stepping over pillows and blankets for days. They became my lifeline, the reason I got out of bed every morning when everything else seemed pointless. Their laughter, their hugs, their pure, untainted love reminded me that not everything in my life was broken. But I also knew I couldn't keep the truth from them forever. The cracks were already starting to show, and eventually they would demand answers I wasn't sure how to give. One afternoon as I was picking the kids up from school, Jackson climbed into the front seat and bombarded me with a question that took my breath away. "Dad, are you and Mom getting a divorce?" I gripped the steering wheel tightly, staring straight ahead of me. "Why are you asking that?" I said, trying hard to keep my tone neutral. He shrugged, but the look on his face was serious. "Because my friend's parents got divorced, and they fought a lot before it happened. You and your mom fight a lot too." I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. "Jackson, your mom and I are going through a difficult time right now, but no decisions have been made. We both love you and your brothers and sisters more than anything, and that will never change." He nodded slowly, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't satisfied. He was old enough to see half-truths, and I knew the day was coming when I would have to answer his questions. Every day I fought to keep their innocence a little longer, even as my own world was crumbling. It wasn't easy, and there were nights when I cried alone, wondering if I had the strength to go through with it. But then I'd see Emily smile, hear Ben giggle, or watch Jackson score a goal at soccer practice and remember why I fought so hard. For them. Always for them. If there was one thing I never thought I would do in my life, it was therapy. Therapy was for people who couldn't handle their problems. That's what I thought. I thought it was too raw, too vulnerable to sit across from a stranger and lay out the deepest, most painful truths of my life. But Melanie insisted, and as much as I hated her for what she had done, I also hated the thought of my children growing up in a single-parent household. So, grudgingly, I agreed. Our first session was a disaster. The therapist's office was small but cozy, with soft lighting and walls hung with inspirational quotes. "The only way out is through. Healing begins when we let it." I hated every single one of them. Sitting here, I felt like I was in a confession I didn't believe in. Melanie and I sat on opposite ends of the couch, silence between us. The therapist, a middle-aged woman named Dr. Harper, sat across from us, her kind eyes darting back and forth like a referee waiting for the first punch. "So, Dr. Harper began, folding her hands in her lap. Why don't we start with why you're here today? I remained silent, letting silence hang in the room. Melanie moved awkwardly, then finally broke the tension. I had an affair, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air, even though we all knew them already. It was the first time she'd said them out loud, and the words pierced her like a stab to her very gut. Dr. Harper nodded, her expression neutral. Thank you for your candor. And how do you feel about being here today, knowing what happened? Melanie looked at me, tears glistening in her eyes. I feel shame, guilty, but I also feel hopeful. I want to make it right, if it can be fixed. Her words made me want to laugh bitterly. Hope? What could she hope for? She was the one who burned everything to the ground. And you? Dr. Harper turned to me. I stared at the floor, clenching my jaw so hard it hurt. I'm here because she asked me to, I finally said. But I don't know if it can be fixed. The next sessions weren't any easier. Each one was like peeling off scabs, exposing wounds that hadn't yet healed. Dr. Harper asked questions that forced us to reveal the ugliest sides of ourselves, and each answer was like pouring salt on an open cut. Why do you think the affair happened? Asked Dr. Harper to Melanie during one of her sessions. Melanie hesitated, tears streaming down her face. I felt invisible, she finally said. Like I was just part of the background in our lives. Like I didn't matter anymore. Her words hit me like a punch in the chest. I'd spent years working my ass off to provide for our family, late nights at the office, weekend part-time jobs. And she felt unnoticed? I worked to give you everything, snapped I, and the anger burst out before I could stop it. I've sacrificed so much for this family, and you're telling me it's not enough? Is that why you cheated on me? Because you felt ignored? It wasn't just that, she said, her voice shaking. It was about everything. The distance between us, the lack of intimacy. It felt like we were roommates, not partners. Maybe we wouldn't be so far apart if you weren't dragging around my brother, I replied, my voice shaking with rage. You can't blame me for that. Dr. Harper interjected, her voice calm but firm. I know it hurts, but we're here to make sense of what happened, not apportion blame. Let's try to focus on how we got here. But I couldn't focus. I was too angry. Not just at Melanie, but at myself. The more we talked, the more I started to doubt everything. How could I have missed it? How had I missed the signs? Had I been so consumed with work, with taking care of my family, that I hadn't noticed my own wife's estrangement from me? I thought back to all those evenings when I stayed late at the office and was too tired to kiss Melanie goodnight when I got home. The weekends when I'd promised to take the kids to the park, but instead immersed myself in paperwork. Was I a bad husband? A bad father? It's not your fault, Dr. Harper said during one of my sessions, as if he'd read my mind. It was Melanie's choice, and she needs to recognize that. But it's also important to understand how the dynamics of your relationship contributed to you being in this position now. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to accept her words, to believe that none of this was on my conscience. But another part of me, perhaps the same part that had always felt the need to make things right, couldn't shake the feeling that I had failed. Failed to make my wife happy. Failed to protect my family. For her part, Melanie seemed genuinely remorseful. She cried during almost every session, apologizing over and over again. She talked about how much she hated herself for what she had done, how she would do anything to regain my trust. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, she said during one particularly emotional session. But I love you and our family. I will do whatever it takes to make things right. Her words sounded sincere, but I couldn't escape the feeling of skepticism. If she loved me so much, why hadn't she thought about that before sneaking around with Ethan? Why hadn't she thought about our children before throwing a grenade into our lives? I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust you again, I said, my voice cold. How do I know it won't happen again the next time you feel invisible? She burst into tears, but I felt no satisfaction, only emptiness. Despite the pain, therapy forced me to face truths I had been avoiding. I began individual sessions with Dr. Harper, and although I was reluctant to open up at first, it became clear that I needed to come face to face with my emotions. Anger, resentment, guilt. I couldn't just bury them and hope they would go away. Forgiving isn't about letting her off the hook, Dr. Harper told me during one of the sessions. It's about releasing yourself from the weight of that pain. Whether you choose to stay in the marriage or not, you have to find a way to heal, for yourself and for your children. I wasn't sure I could forgive Melanie or Ethan, but for the first time, I began to realize that forgiveness wasn't just about them. It was about me too. By the time we finished our 5th session, I realized that therapy is not a magic cure. It wouldn't erase what had happened or make the pain disappear overnight, but it did make me recognize what my life had become, and that's a start. Whether Melanie and I could repair our marriage was still unknown. I didn't know if I could trust her again or if I even wanted to try. But I did know one thing. I had to keep fighting, not for her or us, but for myself and my children. Because no matter how broken I felt, they deserved a father who wasn't consumed by anger and pain. And maybe therapy would help me figure out how to be that kind of father again. The first apology came in the form of a text message. It was late, well past midnight, and I was sitting in a darkened living room where I could hear nothing but the faint hum of the refrigerator. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, and a notification popped up on the screen. Ethan. For a split second I considered ignoring it, let it sit there unread until the battery died. But curiosity, or maybe masochism, took over. I unlocked my phone and opened the message. Text. Hi. I know I'm the last person you want to hear from right now, but I have to say this. I'm sorry, man. I know what I did was wrong. Just terribly wrong. And I hate myself for it. I wasn't thinking about you or my family or anyone else but me. You don't deserve this. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I had to tell you how sorry I am. I stared at the screen, rereading the words over and over. They seemed hollow, empty, as if ripped from a script. Did he really mean it? Or was it just damage control, his way of making himself feel better about what he'd done? Before I could stop myself, I typed a reply. Don't text me again. Then I hit send and threw my phone back on the table, disgusted with both him and myself. The next morning, a voicemail came in. I didn't pay attention to it at first, too busy getting the kids ready for school and trying to pretend everything was okay. But after dropping them off and sitting alone in the quiet car, I finally saw the notification. Ethan had called while I was in the shower and left a 3-minute voicemail. My finger hovered over the play button for a moment before I pressed it, and his voice came over the car speakers. Hey, it's me. I know you don't want to talk to me, but I need to say this out loud. I'm sorry, man. I'm really sorry. What I did to you, what I did to our family, it's unforgivable. I know that, and I know I can't take it all back. If I could, I would do it in a heartbeat. His voice cracked, and I heard him suppress a sob. I don't know why I did it. I mean, I do, but, God, it doesn't matter. Nothing I say will make it better. But I need you to know that I hate myself for what I did. I hate what I did to you. To Melanie. To Mom and Dad. I've ruined everything, and I don't even know how to begin to fix it. He paused, sighing heavily. I love you, kid. You're my brother, and I've looked up to you my whole life. And I can't believe I'm giving it all up. I don't expect you to forgive me. I needed you to hear it. I'm sorry. The voicemail ended with a click, and I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. Part of me wanted to delete the message and pretend I hadn't heard it. But another part of me, perhaps the part that still remembered Ethan, who had once been my best friend, felt something close to pity. It was another week before I finally agreed to see him. My mom kept bugging me, calling every day and urging me. He's your brother, she repeated, as if those 3 words could erase the traces of betrayal. You have to talk to him. I finally gave in, not for Ethan's sake, but for my own. I needed to look him in the eye and hear him say it. I needed to see if there was any truth in what he said, or if he was just trying to save face. We met at a diner halfway between our houses. It was a place we'd gone to often when we were kids, when life was simple and Ethan's worst act was stealing the last piece of pie. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting in a corner booth with his head down and a cup of coffee in front of him. When I lowered myself into the seat across from him, he looked up, his eyes red and puffy. He was crying. Good. Thank you for coming, he said quietly, his voice hoarse. I didn't say anything back, just stared at him, waiting to see what he would say. He was fiddling with the sugar packets on the table, avoiding my gaze. "I'm sorry," he finally said, his voice cracking. "I know I've said it a million times, but I need you to hear it from me in person. I hate what I did to you, to Melanie, to the kids, to everyone. I've ruined everything, and I don't know how to fix it." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "You can't fix it, Ethan. You didn't just cheat on her, you betrayed me. Our parents. Our whole family." He wrinkled his nose, his eyes filling with tears again. I know I betrayed you, and I'll never forgive myself for it." "Good," I said sharply, "because I won't forgive you either." He lowered his gaze to the table, his shoulders slumping under the weight of my words. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then I remembered the messages, the lies, the look on his face when I'd confronted him that day, and all pity vanished. "Why?" I asked finally, lowering my voice. "Why her? Why now? What the hell were you thinking?" He shook his head, his hands shaking as he reached for his coffee. "I don't know," he said quietly. "It started with nothing. Just a conversation. Flirting, maybe. I didn't think it would lead anywhere." "But it did," I said coldly. "You let it." He nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I wasn't thinking about you or the kids or anyone else. I was selfish, and stupid, and weak. I hate myself for that, but it doesn't fix anything." "No, it doesn't fix it," I said bluntly. "And what's the worst part? You didn't just hurt me. You hurt everyone. Mom, Dad, the kids. They're all going to have to live with what you did." "I know," he whispered, his voice trailing off. "I'll never forgive myself for it." For a long time neither of us spoke. The weight of everything hung between us, a chasm that no apology could bridge. When the check came, I slipped out of the booth and stood up. Ethan remained seated, staring at his coffee as if it held the answers to all his problems. "I don't know if I could ever forgive you," I said quietly, "but I needed to hear you say it. And for that matter, I hope you mean it." He looked up at me with eyes that read regret. "Yes, I swear I am." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed him. Then I turned and walked out of the diner, leaving him behind. As I stepped out into the crisp evening air, I felt a strange mix of emotions, danger, sadness, and maybe a faint glimmer of relief. It wasn't closure, not at all, but it was a step, and for the moment, it was enough. Forgiveness. The word alone left a bitter taste in my mouth. I'd never thought about it before. What did it even mean? Did it mean forgetting what Melanie and Ethan had done to me? Does it mean letting them off the hook, wiping it all away as if nothing happened? If that's what forgiveness is, I want no part of it. But as much as I wanted to give up on the idea entirely, it was impossible to deny the weight I was carrying. Anger sat on my chest like a constant companion every morning when I woke up and clung to my shoulders as I went about my business. It seeped into everything, affecting the way I talked to my kids, the way I interacted with coworkers, the way I looked at myself in the mirror. It was exhausting. Some days I felt like the anger was all I had left, that if I let it go I would collapse under the weight of the emptiness it left behind. Therapy forced me to recognize this. Dr. Harper, with her annoyingly calm demeanor and endless stream of questions, wouldn't let me ignore it. Forgiveness doesn't mean justifying their actions, she told me in one of my sessions. It doesn't mean pretending it never happened, or even reconciling with them. But holding so much anger inside is like drinking poison and expecting them to get sick. You're carrying that weight yourself. Her words stuck with me, as much as I wanted them to. One evening, when the kids had gone to bed and the house was quiet, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table with a notepad and pen. Dr. Harper had asked me during our last session, "What do you think forgiveness looks like? For them or for you?" I didn't have an answer then, but now, looking at the blank sheet in front of me, I realized I needed to figure it out. I started by writing down what forgiveness is not. It didn't mean that what they did was okay. It was not allowing them back into my life without consequences. It's not pretending that I'm still hurt and not angry. Then I wrote what I thought it might be. Maybe forgiveness was about letting go of the control they still had over me. Maybe it was about letting go of the constant cycle of pain and betrayal. Maybe it was about finding a way to move forward, even if the scars never fully healed. Melanie, for her part, never stopped trying to earn my forgiveness. Every day she did something, cooking my favorite meal, leaving apology notes, offering to do more with the kids so I could rest. She quit her job, saying she needed a fresh start, and that she wanted to prove to me that she was serious about fixing our marriage. She even started going to church again, something she hadn't done in years. "I'm trying, Nick," she told me one night after another intense therapy session. "I know I can't undo what I did, but I'm trying to show you that I'm still the person you fell in love with." Her words made me want to laugh and cry at the same time. How could she think that I would ever see her the same person again? But what scared me the most, what I couldn't admit to anyone, not even Dr. Harper, was that part of me wanted to believe her. A week later, I found myself standing in front of my parents' house, staring at the front door and wondering if I should even knock. It had been months since the family fight, and the situation wasn't getting any easier. My mom was still desperate to make things right and called me almost daily, reminding me that family is family. My father, on the other hand, made it clear that he wanted nothing to do with Ethan. "That boy is a disgrace," he said the last time we spoke. "I don't care if I never see him again." I wasn't sure which was better, my mother's relentless hope or my father's cold finality. All I knew was that I didn't want to spend the rest of my life stuck somewhere in between. Finally I knocked, and my mom answered almost immediately, hugging me tightly. "Oh, Nick," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so happy to see you." She led me into the house, and we sat down in the living room, the silence stretching between us until she finally spoke. "You know," she said softly, "forgiveness isn't about them. It's about you." I looked at her fearfully. "What do you mean?" She sighed, rubbing the hem of her sweater. "I forgave your father a long time ago for something I didn't think I could do. Not because he deserved it, but because I deserved peace. I think you deserve it too." Her words stayed with me long after I left. Was it really that simple? Would I be able to forgive not Melanie or Ethan, but myself? And if so, what would that be like? Would I feel lighter, freer, or would I just feel empty? I didn't have any answers, but for the first time, I felt like I was starting to ask the right questions. That evening I sat down at the kitchen table again, the same notebook in front of me. This time I wrote a letter. Not to Melanie or Ethan, but to myself. I wrote about the pain, the anger, the betrayal. I wrote about how much I hated what they had done to me, but also how much I hated that they were still affecting my life. When I was done, tears were streaming down my face, but I felt lighter. Not healed, not whole, but like I had taken the first step towards something that might resemble peace. Forgiveness still seemed like a foreign concept to me. I wasn't sure I'd ever fully understand it, but as I folded the letter and tucked it away, I realized that maybe it wasn't about understanding. Maybe it's about trying, about gradually letting go of the poison and hoping that one day the weight would no longer seem so heavy. And for the first time in months, that was enough. After everything that had happened, Melanie had fallen head over heels into the role of the remorseful wife. Her determination to prove that she could fix the marriage she had destroyed was almost overwhelming. At first her efforts seemed like a drop in the ocean of my anger and pain, but as the days turned into weeks, I couldn't help but notice how hard she was trying. But the cracks in my trust weren't just deep, they were gaping, and no matter how much she tried to put a band-aid on them, I couldn't imagine them ever being whole again. The first thing Melanie did was delete all of her social media accounts. It was one of those symbolic gestures that had more performance art than meaning, but she insisted it was necessary. "I don't want distractions," she said, sitting on the couch with her phone in her lap. "I want to focus on you, on us." I watched her flipping through apps, hitting the deactivate button on Facebook, Instagram, and even Twitter. I didn't say anything, but in the back of my mind I wondered if it was really about me or about erasing the evidence of what she'd done. She went even further. She deleted all the contacts on her phone that weren't family members or someone important, like the kids' school. I didn't ask her to do this, but she showed me her screen anyway, scrolling through the empty contact list like it was a badge of honor. "See?" she said, her voice shaking. "I'm not hiding anything from you. I want to be transparent." It was hard to believe her when, for months, She hadn't been transparent at all. The next big step happened a week later. She quit her job. I didn't realize she had done it until she came home one afternoon with a box of office supplies and tears in her eyes. She set the box on the kitchen table and sank into a chair, kneading her hands. "I couldn't stay there," she said, her voice shaking. "Not after everything." It didn't feel right, like a constant reminder of what I'd done. Work was an important part of her identity. She'd spent years working her way up the ladder at her company, working late nights and weekends to build a career she was proud of. And now she just walked away from it like that. Part of me wanted to feel moved by this gesture. She was cutting ties, making sacrifices to prove her commitment to rebuilding what was left of our marriage. But another part of me, perhaps the bigger part, couldn't help but feel that it was too little and too late. One night, when the kids were already asleep, she sat me down in the living room. She looked exhausted, her eyes red and swollen with tears, and her hands nervously clutched her knees. "Nick," she said, her voice shaking, "I know I can't undo what I did. I know I've hurt you in ways I can't even imagine. But I'm begging you, please don't give up on us." I remained silent, letting her continue. "We've built a life together. A family. We've been through a lot. I know I've violated your trust, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to get it back. For the sake of the kids. For us. Please, just don't go." Her words were sincere, and I could see the desperation in her eyes. But at the same time, they felt like a burden. The weight of her remorse, her hope, was crushing, and I didn't know if I had the strength to carry it. I tried to give her a head start, to trust that her efforts were sincere. But trust is a fragile thing, and once it's shattered, it's almost impossible to put it back together. Every time she left the house, I wondered where she was really going. Every time her phone buzzed, I felt suspicious, even though she always showed me who was texting. It was exhausting being on edge all the time, doubting everything. And it wasn't just about the affair. It was about the lies, the secrecy, the way she looked me in the eye and pretended everything was fine while she was secretly dating my brother. How do you get over something like that? Melanie started doing little things to show that she was committed to rebuilding our marriage. She would leave notes in my lunch bag, apologizing over and over again and telling me how much she loved me. She planned date nights, even though I could barely find the enthusiasm to sit through them. She even offered to renew our wedding vows. I couldn't even think about it without feeling queasy in my stomach. "I want to start over," she said one evening as we sat on the back porch. "With a clean slate. I know it's a lot to ask, but I want to show you that I have it all ahead of me." I looked at her, this woman I'd once loved so much, and I felt an ache in my chest. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to have the same feelings for her that I had before. But the cracks still remained, and no amount of effort on her part seemed to be able to fill them. The hardest part was how much the kids wanted us to stay together. They didn't know the details, of course, but they sensed the tension and did their best to pull us back together in their own innocent way. "Why aren't you and Mom hugging anymore?" asked Emily one night as I tucked her into bed. I forced myself to smile, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "We're just dealing with some adult issues, sweetie. But we both love you very much. Maybe if you cuddle you'll feel better," she said sincerely. Her words stayed with me long after I left her room. The kids deserved a happy, stable home. But was it worth pretending everything was okay if it meant keeping the family together? Or would it teach them to accept less than they deserved in their own lives? As much as I appreciated Melanie's efforts, they were like bandages on a wound too deep to heal. She tried, yes, but no amount of effort could erase what she had done. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get rid of the image of her and Ethan together. Every time I looked at her, I saw betrayal. Every touch, every kiss seemed tainted to me. I wanted to forget about it, for the sake of the kids, for the life we'd built. But the truth was, I didn't know if I could do that. One night, lying in bed and looking up at the ceiling, I asked myself the same question over and over again. Is love enough? I loved the life we had built together. I loved the memories we shared, the family we created. But did I still love her? Or was I holding on to something that was already gone? Melanie was trying, that much was obvious. But sometimes trying isn't enough. And as much as I wanted to believe in second chances, I couldn't ignore the voice in the back of my mind that told me some things couldn't be forgiven. Not yet. Or maybe never. Religion was never the cornerstone of our marriage. When we were growing up, Melanie and I attended church with our families, but it was more of a Sunday morning obligation than a spiritual calling. By the time we were married, neither of us gave it much more thought than to attend on Easter and Christmas to keep the grandparents happy. So when Melanie suddenly started going to church again, I didn't know how to feel about it. It all started a few weeks after she quit her job. One Sunday morning, she dressed the kids in nice clothes, told me she was taking them to church, and asked if I wanted to join. No, thank you, I replied without hesitation. The thought of having to sit in a pew while she played the part of the penitent sinner made my stomach churn. She nodded, a flicker of sadness on her face, and then she turned back to the children. I watched as they loaded into the car and drove away, leaving me alone in the house. For the first time in weeks, I was left to myself. But instead of relief, I felt uneasy, as if something had changed between us and I didn't know where it would lead. From then on, church became part of her weekly routine. Every Sunday she would get up early, dress the kids, and head to the local Methodist church a few blocks away. At first I thought it was just another one of her attempts to prove she was changing, but as the weeks passed, I noticed something had changed in her. She started leaving sticky notes with Bible verses on the bathroom mirror and on the refrigerator. She quietly turned on Christian music while cooking dinner. She started praying with the kids before bedtime, something we had never done before. "I've been talking to Pastor Jeff," she told me one evening as we sat on the back porch. "He's helping me figure things out. Helps me find peace." "That must be nice," I muttered, taking a sip of my beer. She looked at me, her expression calm but serious. "You should come with us next week. It might help." "Help with what?" snapped I, the bitterness in my voice sounding harsher than I intended. "Prayers won't undo what you did, Melanie." "I know that," she said quietly, "but it can help you find clarity, maybe even peace." I shook my head mockingly. "I'll pass." Despite my resistance, the following Sunday I sat in the last row of church. I don't know why I agreed to go. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was fatigue. Or maybe it was the faint hope that Melanie's newfound faith might provide answers to questions I couldn't find on my own. The sanctuary was warm and inviting, filled with the sounds of organ music and the chatter of the congregation. Melanie sat with the children in the front row, and I kept close behind, trying to remain as inconspicuous as possible. Pastor Jeff, a middle-aged man with a kind smile, preached a sermon on forgiveness that morning. He talked about grace, redemption, and the power of letting go. His words were well-meaning, but they seemed hollow to me. "Forgiveness is not about the person who wronged you," he said. "It's about letting go of the shackles of anger and resentment. It's about finding peace in your own heart." I clenched my jaws and stared at the floor. How could he stand there and talk about peace like it was so easy to find? He didn't know what it was like to have your life ripped apart by the people you trusted the most. He didn't know how hard it was to bear such a betrayal. When the service was over, Melanie found me at the door. "What do you think?" she asked, her eyes full of hope. "It was fine," I replied curtly, squeezed past her and headed for the car. That night I lay in bed and ran through the sermon in my head. Forgiveness, grace, redemption. They sounded good in theory, but in practice they seemed impossible. How was I supposed to forgive Melanie? Or Ethan? And what did atonement even mean in a situation like this? I thought about the sticky notes Melanie had left around the house. One of them caught my eye that day. "Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving one another, just as in Christ God forgave you." Ephesians 4 verse 32. Forgive as God forgives. Is that what Melanie was trying to do? Is it even possible for someone like me who couldn't stop replaying the betrayal over and over in my head? A few weeks later, Melanie convinced me to meet with Pastor Jeff one-on-one. I didn't want to, but figured it couldn't hurt to hear what he had to say. We sat in his office, a cozy room littered with books and pictures of his family. He listened patiently while I poured out my anger, my pain, my doubts about Melanie's sudden devotion to faith. "She says she's changing," I said bitterly. "But how do I know that's really true? How do I know this isn't just another way for her to feel better while I'm still in shambles?" Pastor Jeff nodded thoughtfully. I won't pretend I have all the answers, he said. But I can tell you this, faith is not about perfection. It's about transformation. If Melanie is truly seeking forgiveness and trying to rebuild what has been broken, that's already a step in the right direction. But forgiveness has to be your choice, Nick. Not hers. Not mine. Yours. His words hit me harder than I expected. Forgiveness isn't something I can fake, not something I can do for someone else. If I was ever going to find the strength in my heart to forgive Melanie, it had to come from within. Over the next few months, I attended church irregularly, mostly at Melanie's insistence. I still didn't feel at home there, but I couldn't deny that something in the sermons resonated with me. The idea of grace, of finding peace through something greater than myself, was both comforting and frightening. Melanie's faith seemed genuine. She became calmer, more patient, more present with the children. She prayed for me every night, even when I asked her not to. "I'm not asking God to fix everything," she said one evening as we sat on the porch. "I'm asking him to give me the strength to keep trying, and to give you the strength to heal." I didn't say anything back, but her words stayed with me. One Sunday morning, as I watched Melanie and the children sing a hymn in the front row, I felt something change inside me. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a realization. I didn't want to carry that anger inside me forever. I didn't want to let it define me, poison the life I was trying to rebuild for myself and my children. Perhaps faith wasn't the answer. Perhaps I would never be able to accept her the way Melanie did. But if it helped her become a better person, a better mother, a better partner, then maybe it could help me find a way forward too. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to have hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And sometimes that's all you need. Family. It should be a source of strength, a safe haven in the storms of life. But in the weeks and months that followed, my extended family felt less like a support system and more like a jury deliberating my life. Everyone had an opinion about what I should do, and none of them were shy about sharing it. At first, I appreciated the concern. The phone calls, the visits, the offers to take the kids for a few hours. It was like life preservers while I was drowning. But as time went on, all this well-meaning advice began to feel like an onslaught. Everyone seemed to think they knew what was best for me, for Melanie, for the kids, and for our shattered family. It started, of course, with my mom. She was the loudest advocate for reconciliation, her pleas riddled with guilt and despair. "Nick, you have to think about the kids," she said during one of her daily phone calls. "They deserve a stable family. You and Melanie can handle that. She's trying, isn't she? Doesn't that make a difference?" "Trying doesn't undo what she did, Mom," I snapped, rubbing my temples. "You can't just try to get rid of betrayal," she sighed, and I could practically hear her spreading her hands on the other end of the line. "I know what she did was wrong, but people make mistakes, Nick. Big ones. If there's any chance of saving your marriage, shouldn't you take it?" I soon ended the conversation, too exhausted to argue. But her words stayed with me, simmering in the back of my mind. My father, on the other hand, stood firmly on the cut-them-off position. He had never been prone to emotional displays, but when it came to Ethan, his anger became palpable. "That boy is dead to me," he said bluntly during a rare father-son conversation. He crossed a line beyond which there is no going back. "And as for Melanie, well, you're a grown man. But if I were you, I wouldn't give her any reason to think she could just apologize to get out of it." His words were harsh, but part of me found comfort in them. It was nice to have someone validate my anger, to tell me that I wasn't crazy to think that some betrayals were unforgivable. Yet his absolutism left no room for the complex jumble of emotions I was wading through. The real chaos began when news of the betrayal reached my cousins, aunts, and uncles. My mom must have blabbed about it during one of her emotional sessions, because suddenly everyone had an opinion about my marriage. One of my cousins, Emily, cornered me at a family barbecue. "I'm just going to say this," she began in a conspiratorial tone. "You need to get away from her, Nick. Staying with her will only drag you down. You'll never heal if you keep remembering what she did all the time." I nodded politely, but before I could answer anything, my Aunt Linda entered the conversation. "What about the children?" she said, clutching a glass of iced tea in her hands. "Divorce is hard on the kids. Don't you think it's better to work things out if you can? For their sake? It's not that simple, I muttered, wishing I could dissolve into the lawn chair and disappear. Well, you can't let her bypass you, Emily continued without pausing. She cheated, Nick, with your brother. That's unforgivable. And yet people forgive all the time, Aunt Linda objected, her tone righteous. It takes effort, but it's what's best for the family. Their voices became a cacophony, each trying to drown out the other, and I sat silent, not wanting to be the subject of their argument. Even my siblings couldn't resist voicing their opinions. My youngest sister, Rachel, was furious on my behalf. She doesn't deserve you, Rachel said during one of our late-night phone conversations. And Ethan? I don't even want to say his name. You need to cut them both out of your life. You're too good for that, Nick. Her anger was comforting in a way, but it also made me feel like I had to live up to her expectations, to be strong, determined, unwavering. My older brother, Mark, was more reserved. Look, he said one evening over a mug of beer, this is your life. Not mine, not Mom's, not anyone else's. You're the one who's going to have to wake up every day and live with this decision. So whatever you do, make sure it's what you want, not what other people tell you to do. It was the most sensible advice I'd heard in the past few weeks, but it didn't make the decision any easier. As if the personal intervention wasn't enough, the drama spilled over to social media. A distant cousin I hadn't spoken to in years sent me a private message offering unsolicited advice. Hey Nick, the message read, I heard about what happened. Just wanted to say that forgiveness is hard, but it's the Christian thing to do. Praying for you. I stared at the message, amused and annoyed in equal measure. Who was this guy to tell me what a Christian act was? He hadn't even been to a family reunion in over a decade. Another cousin, a self-proclaimed relationship expert, posted a vague status update that I was sure applied to me. Sometimes walking away is the bravest thing you can do. Hashtag self-respect, hashtag know your worth. I soon logged out, unable to tolerate any more passive-aggressive posts and thinly veiled advice. By the time the holidays came around, the meddling had reached a climax. Thanksgiving dinner turned into a battlefield, with half the family subtly, or not so subtly, pressuring me to reconcile and the other half urging me to leave. I can't believe you're even considering staying with her, Emily hissed during dessert, her voice low enough that only I could hear it. Have you thought about what the kids will go through if you divorce? Whispered Aunt Linda a few minutes later. Even Melanie, who tried her best to stay out of the family drama, wasn't left out. My mom cornered her in the kitchen, her voice soft but insistent. You have to keep fighting for him, she said. Don't let him give up. By the end of the evening, I felt like a rag doll being yanked in different directions. It wasn't until I spoke to Dr. Harper again that I realized how much the family's opinion had clouded my judgment. Nick, she said during our session, whose life are you living? Yours or theirs? Mine, I automatically answered. Are you sure? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Because it sounds like you're letting their voices drown out your own. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. She was right. I tried so hard to please everyone, to take their advice into consideration, that I'd stopped realizing what I wanted myself. For the first time in months, I realized I needed to shut out the noise and focus on what was right for me and my children. No one else's opinion mattered. Not my mom's opinion. Not my dad's opinion. Not Emily's opinion, or Aunt Linda's, or anyone else's. This was my life. My decision. And it was time to start living it on my terms. I used to think of hope as something solid, a bulwark to lean on when life got hard. But in the months since the betrayal, hope has become more like smoke, flickering, impermanent, impossible to hold on to for long. And yet amidst the chaos of broken trust, family drama, and my own simmering anger, there were moments, however fleeting, that reminded me of what life used to be like. Moments that made me wonder if the pieces of my broken world could be put back together. One warm Saturday afternoon, I sat on my porch, sipping warm coffee and staring blankly at the yard. Jackson and Emily were racing a soccer ball back and forth, and Ben was running after them, shouting nonsensical instructions like a little coach. Pass. Kick. Faster. They laughed, their faces shining in the sunlight, and for a moment the heaviness on my chest lessened. I was struck by how much joy they still found in the little things, how resilient they were despite everything that had happened. "Come play, Daddy," called Jackson, waving me over. I hesitated, staring at my coffee as if it were an anchor holding me to the porch. But then Ben came over and took my hand, his big brown eyes looking at me expectantly. "Pooey," he said simply. I set down my mug and followed him out into the yard, letting myself get caught up in their game. For the next half hour, I was neither a devoted husband nor a man trying to figure out my future. I was just Dad, laughing when Ben tried to kick the ball and fell over, cheering when Emily scored a goal against her older brother, and smiling so hard my cheeks ached. Later that evening, when the kids had already gone to bed, Melanie and I found ourselves in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner. It was one of those rare moments when the tension between us wasn't stifling. As we loaded the dishwasher, I muttered something sarcastic about how many cups the kids seemed to drink in a day. Melanie, without missing a beat, replied, "They probably think we own stock in the glass factory." It wasn't particularly funny, but the way she said it, her light voice, her unguarded smile, caught me off guard. Before I realized it, I laughed. Not the forced, polite laugh I'd been giving her for months, but a hearty giggle that made my chest ache. She laughed, too, and for a fleeting moment I thought it was just like old times. Like we were still that couple who joked about everything from work stress to childhood habits. Of course, that feeling didn't last long. Reality always has a way of coming back. But as I went to bed that night, I thought about how I couldn't hold back that laughter and wondered if it was a sign that not everything between us was shattered beyond repair. The next week, Melanie suggested we have a family dinner at the table instead of letting the kids eat in front of the TV. I wasn't thrilled with the idea. Our previous attempts at family dinners had been tense and awkward, but I agreed. To my surprise, it wasn't a disaster. Melanie made the spaghetti, Emily helped set the table, and even Jackson got involved by grating the Parmesan cheese. As we sat down to eat, the kids started chattering about how the day had gone, their voices overlapping in a chaotic but cozy way. "Daddy, did you know Emily got a gold star in math today?" said Jackson with a mouthful of spaghetti. "EW, don't talk with your mouth full," Emily replied, giggling. Ben, not wanting to be left out, shouted, "I got a star too," even though I didn't. I smiled as I listened to them. Their joy was contagious. Melanie caught my gaze across the table and smiled uncertainly. It wasn't much, but it was like a truce, a moment of peace in the middle of a storm. Little moments like that began to happen more and more often. A quiet evening watching a movie with the kids. A shared joke while doing laundry. Even a few evenings when Melanie and I managed to talk without the shadow of an affair looming over us. They were fleeting, like fireflies on a summer night, brief flashes of light that disappeared almost as quickly as they appeared. But they were enough to make me wonder, would we be able to recover? For every moment of light, however, there were a dozen reminders of pain. Trust doesn't come back easily, and every time Melanie's phone rang or she left the house without telling me where she was going, my thoughts swirled. The image of her and Ethan together still haunted me like a phantom that didn't want to let go. And yet I couldn't deny the progress. She was trying, harder than I could have imagined. She was doing everything she could to show me her commitment. Planning date nights, helping with the kids, continuing to attend church. But effort is not the same as assurance. And the cracks in our foundation still remained, no matter how much she tried to putty over them. One night as I was putting Jackson to bed, he looked up at me and asked, "Daddy, are you and Mommy going to be okay?" His question caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know what to answer. "We're trying, buddy," I finally said. "It's complicated." He nodded, his expression turning serious. "I just want you to be happy. Both of you." His words didn't leave me long after he fell asleep. I wanted to be happy too, for myself, for my children, for the life I'd worked so hard to build. But was happiness with Melanie possible? Or would staying with her mean settling for something less than what I deserved? As the weeks passed, I found myself thinking more and more about what hope was. Was hope a sign of strength, or was it simply a way to avoid the inevitable? Was I clinging to those moments of light because I truly believed reconciliation was possible, or because I was afraid to let them go. I didn't have the answers yet, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure that was a bad thing. Maybe hope didn't lie in knowing the outcome. Maybe it was about living one day at a time, finding joy in the small moments, and trusting that the path forward, whatever it was, would open up in time. And maybe that was enough. It's been almost a year since the day my world came crashing down, when I found those messages and told Melanie about her betrayal. A year of therapy sessions, intense conversations, family drama, and endless heartache. A year of questioning everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and forgiveness. But no matter how much time passed, one truth remained constant. I had to make a choice. Staying would mean rebuilding a marriage on a foundation that had been razed to the ground. It would mean learning to trust Melanie again, a process that seemed both daunting and exhausting. And it would mean putting the children's sense of stability above my own pain. On the other hand, leaving would mean starting over. It would mean splitting our family apart, navigating the murky waters of co-parenting, and accepting that the life I envisioned for myself and my children was over. There were no easy answers. No matter what I chose, someone had to get hurt. One Saturday, I decided to take a day for myself. I took the kids to my mom's house and told Melanie I needed time to think. She didn't argue, just nodded and said, "Take as much time as you need." I drove aimlessly for a while, and eventually ended up at a park where we often took the kids when they were younger. It was a crisp fall day, cool air, and a riot of red and gold leaves. I found an empty bench overlooking the lake and sat down, letting the silence wash over me. As I stared out at the water, I was flooded with memories. The day Melanie and I brought Jackson home from the hospital, scared but happy to be parents. How Emily rode her bike without wheels for the first time, with Melanie cheering her on from the driveway. When Ben spilled a whole gallon of milk on the kitchen floor, and we both laughed until our sides hurt. Now those memories seemed like a cruel joke, a reminder of what I'd lost, or maybe what I was still trying to hold on to. I pulled out the notebook I'd brought with me and started writing. On one page, I listed my reasons for staying. The kids deserve a stable family. Melanie is sincerely trying to make things right. We've built a life together, and there's still love in there somewhere. On the opposite page, I listed reasons for leaving. I don't know if I can trust her again. The betrayal has changed the way I think about her, about us. By staying, I can teach my children that it's okay to accept less than they deserve. I stared at the lists, not feeling any closer to an answer. In the evening, I stopped by my parents' house to pick up the kids. Dad was in the garage, fiddling with an old radio, and I decided to join him for a few minutes. "What's up, Nick?" he asked without looking up. "Honestly, I feel like I'm spinning in circles," I admitted. He set the tools aside and gave me a long, assessing look. "You're trying to make the perfect decision," he said. "But life doesn't work that way. There's no perfect answer here, just one you can live with." His words hit me harder than I expected. That night, after the kids went to bed, I sat with Melanie in the living room. She looked nervous, as if she sensed what was about to happen. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," I began, my voice steady but quiet. "And I've made a decision." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't interrupt. "I want to try," I said. "Not because I've come to terms with what happened, and not because I've completely forgiven you, but because I still see something worth saving. For the children. For us. But it's going to take time. A lot of time. And I need you to understand that it won't be easy for any of us." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'll do whatever it takes," she whispered. In the weeks that followed, we began to take small steps toward rebuilding our marriage. We attended couples therapy regularly, diving into the uncomfortable truths and pain that festered between us. Melanie continued to make changes in her life, proving her commitment not just in words but in deeds. Of course, there were setbacks, moments when anger flared up again, when I questioned whether I had made the right choice. But there were also moments of hope, like when we spent an evening playing board games with the kids and laughing like we used to, or when Melanie held my hand during a particularly emotional therapy session. As the months moved into the new year, I realized that healing was not a straight path. It was confusing, full of twists and turns and doubt, but it was also full of possibilities. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if we would ever fully recover from the betrayal, or if the cracks in our foundation would always be a reminder of what we had been through. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was going towards something rather than running away from it. Life is not about perfection, and it's about learning to live with your scars, to carry them without letting them define you. Standing at the crossroads of my life, I knew there were no guarantees, but I also knew that I was stronger than I was a year ago, and that strength gave me hope, not just for my marriage, but for myself. The road ahead would not be easy, but I was going to walk it with all the scars.